Forget everything you know about gas stations. On Highway 666, the rules aren't just strange, they're downright terrifying. From the customer who vanishes into thin air to the eerie whispers that follow you from pump to pump, this isn't just a job. It's a descent into the inexplicable. Stick around if you dare, because tonight, things are getting weird. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. A vast expanse of nothing punctuated only by scrub brush and the occasional skeletal remains of a long-dead cactus. Highway 666 cut through this wasteland like a scar, and at mile marker 139, squatting beneath a sky that seemed too big and too empty, set the crossroads gas and convenience. The building looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and bad decisions, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the wood like dead skin. A single flickering sign buzzed overhead, casting sickly orange light across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I pulled my beat-up Honda into the employee spot around back at exactly 10:47 p.m., 13 minutes before my shift began. The previous attendant, an older man named Joe Whitaker, had been insistent about punctuality during our brief handoff yesterday. His eyes had held a peculiar intensity when he'd gripped my shoulder and said, "Always arrive early, Ethan. Always. You'll need every minute to prepare." At the time, I'd assumed he meant stocking shelves or counting the register. But now, staring at the gas station's dark windows, I wasn't so sure. The wind picked up as I approached the front entrance, carrying with it the smell of hot asphalt and something else, something vaguely organic and rotten. Tumbleweeds skittered across the empty highway, their dry rustling the only sound for miles. There were no other cars, no headlights in either direction, nothing but darkness and that oppressive sense of isolation that makes you acutely aware of how small you are against the vastness of the world. Joe was waiting inside, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. His face was drawn and pale, the fluorescent lights overhead making the shadows under his eyes look like bruises. He'd aged a decade since yesterday, or maybe I just hadn't noticed how haggard he looked before. "You're here," he said, and there was unmistakable relief in his voice. "Good. We need to go over everything before I leave." The interior of the gas station was standard fare, or at least it tried to be. Aisles of chips and candy, a wall of refrigerated drinks, a coffee station that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. But there was something off about the proportions, like the space was slightly larger on the inside than it should have been. The back wall seemed to recede into shadows that the fluorescent lights couldn't quite penetrate, and the air had a stale quality that made each breath feel recycled. Joe pulled a leather-bound book from beneath the counter and set it down with a heavy thud. The cover was cracked and faded, the leather worn smooth in some places and peeling away in others. No title marked its spine or face, just a series of dark stains that might have been oil or might have been something worse. "This," Joe said, tapping the cover with one yellowed fingernail, "is the rule book. Everything you need to know about working the night shift is in here. Read it, memorize it, and for the love of God, follow it." I reached for the book, but Joe's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes locked onto mine, and what I saw there made my stomach clench. It wasn't just fear, it was knowledge, the kind of terrible understanding that comes from experiencing things that shouldn't exist. "I'm serious, Ethan. These aren't suggestions. They're not corporate policy or health code regulations. These rules are the only thing standing between you and—" He trailed off, his grip loosening. "Just follow them. Every single one." He released my wrist and stepped back, suddenly eager to leave. "I've got to go. Shift change is at 11 sharp and need to be gone by then. The lights need to stay on, all of them, no matter what. That's rule number 1. He was already moving toward the door, pulling his jacket on despite the desert heat. "You'll do fine. Just don't deviate from the rules." Then he was gone, his truck's taillights disappearing down Highway 666 within seconds. leaving me alone with the humming fluorescent lights and that damn book. I checked my watch. 10:58 p.m. 2 minutes until my shift officially began. The wind had died completely, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. Not even the usual sounds of the building settling. No creaks or groans. Just an absolute stillness that felt wrong. I opened the rulebook, and the spine cracked with a sound like breaking bone. The first page was yellowed with age, covered in cramped handwriting that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. The ink was dark brown, not black, and it bled through the paper in places. Rule number 1 was written at the top in larger letters, underlined 3 times. Always keep the lights on. All of them, no matter what. Simple enough, though the emphasis seemed excessive. I continued reading, and with each rule, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Rule number 2, never accept payment in the form of a $2 bill. If a customer attempts to pay with one, refuse the transaction and ask them to leave immediately. Do not make eye contact. Do not engage in conversation. Simply ask them to leave. Rule number 3 made my hands go cold. Between the hours of 12 a.m. and 3 a.m., if you see something outside that looks like a person but doesn't move like one, do not investigate. Do not open the door. Do not acknowledge its presence. Keep your eyes on the register and wait for it to leave. There were 17 rules in total, each more unsettling than the last. Rule 8 stated that if the pay phone rings, there was a pay phone. Answer it, but do not speak first. Listen to what the voice says. Write it down word for word, and hang up after exactly 30 seconds. Rule 12 forbade making eye contact with anyone who entered the store wearing sunglasses after dark. Rule 15, written in shakier handwriting than the others, simply said, if the deer asks you a question, answer truthfully. Your life may depend on it. I set the book down and rubbed my eyes, trying to process what I just read. This had to be some kind of hazing ritual, a joke played on every new hire to see if they buy into the supernatural nonsense. The isolation of the place probably got to people, made them see things that weren't there, create elaborate fantasies to cope with the monotony and loneliness of working the graveyard shift in the middle of nowhere. But Joe's face kept flashing through my mind, the genuine terror in his eyes, the way his hands had trembled when he touched the rulebook. That wasn't the look of someone playing a prank. That was the look of someone who'd seen something that fundamentally changed their understanding of reality. My watch beeped, startling me badly enough that I knocked over a display of beef jerky. 11 p.m. My shift had officially begun. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, twice, then steadied. In that brief moment of dimness, I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows at the back of the store, something tall and angular that didn't quite fit the shape of the shelving units. But when the lights stabilized, there was nothing there, just aisles of junk food and the steady hum of the refrigeration units. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to relax. It was going to be a long night, and letting my imagination run wild wouldn't help. I had rules to follow, a store to monitor, and 8 hours until dawn. How bad could it really be? The payphone I hadn't noticed before, mounted on the wall near the restrooms, began to ring. Its shrill bell cut through the silence like a knife, and I felt every muscle in my body tense. I looked at the rule book, still open on the counter. Rule 8 stared back at me, the handwriting suddenly seeming less like a joke and more like a warning written in desperation. The phone continued to ring, each peal seeming louder than the last, echoing through the empty gas station. My feet carried me toward it before my brain had fully processed the decision to move. The receiver was cold against my ear, colder than it should have been, and I waited, not speaking, just as the rule instructed. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing. Then a voice, distant and hollow, like it was traveling through miles of empty pipe, whispered, "They're already inside." The line went dead before I could react. leaving only the hollow sound of static that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. My hand shook as I hung up the receiver, the plastic clattering against the metal cradle. I grabbed a notepad Joe had left by the register and scribbled down the message with trembling fingers. They're already inside. The words looked even more ominous, written in my own handwriting. Stark black ink against white paper. I stood there for a moment, listening. The refrigeration units hummed their mechanical song. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. But beneath those familiar sounds, I could have sworn there was something else, a faint scratching noise coming from somewhere in the store. I forced myself to return to the counter, to the rule book that suddenly felt less like a joke and more like a survival manual. Rule number 4 caught my attention. Do not stock shelves between midnight and 3 a.m. If items fall from shelves during these hours, leave them on the floor until morning. I glanced at the clock. 11:07 p.m. Still safe, for now. But the implication was clear. Something happened during those hours. Something that made it dangerous to be in the aisles, vulnerable and exposed. Rule number 6 was even more specific. If a customer shadow moves independently of their body, complete the transaction as quickly as possible. Do not comment on it. Do not stare at the shadow. Give them their change and watch them leave. Once they exit, lock the door for exactly 5 minutes. Set a timer. Do not unlock it early, no matter who or what has to be let in. The detail of these rules suggested they'd been learned through experience, refined through trial and error. How many night shift workers had there been before me? How many had figured out these rules the hard way? I thought about Joe's haunted eyes and wondered what he'd seen. What had happened to him in this building that made him so desperate to follow every instruction to the letter? A sudden bang from the back of the store made me jump, my heart hammering against my ribs. One of the refrigerator doors had swung open on its own, the interior light spilling out into the aisle. I stared at it, remembering rule number 9. If the refrigerator doors open by themselves, close them within 30 seconds. Do not look at what might be standing inside them. Just close the door and walk away. I checked my watch and started counting. 29, 28, 27. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward the open refrigerator, keeping my eyes fixed on the door itself, not on the dark space beyond the rows of energy drinks and beer. The cold air rolling out smelled wrong, not like refrigeration, but like a cave, damp and ancient. 20 seconds. 15. My hand reached for the door handle, and I could feel something watching me from inside that cold space, something that held its breath as I held mine. 10 seconds. I grabbed the handle and pulled the door shut with more force than necessary, the magnetic seal making a solid thunk as it closed. I didn't run back to the counter, but it was a near thing. My hands were shaking when I picked up the rule book again, and I noticed something I'd missed before. In the margins of several pages, someone had written additional notes in different ink, newer additions to the original rules. Next to rule number 7, do not serve anyone who cannot cast a shadow in the overhead lights. Someone had written. Tried to ignore this one. He stood at the counter for 6 hours. 6 hours. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Just stared. Finally left at dawn. Nearly quit that night. Another note. This one next to rule number 11. If you hear your name being called from the storage room, do not respond. Do not investigate. Your name is not coming from anyone who means you well. The margin note read, it knows things about you. Personal things. Don't listen. Don't listen. Don't listen. I was beginning to understand why Joe had looked so broken. This wasn't a job. It was psychological warfare, a nightly game of survival against forces that didn't play by any rational rules. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was existential. Out here on Highway 666, miles from the nearest town, the normal laws of reality seemed to bend and warp like heat mirages on the asphalt. Rule number 13 was one of the strangest. If a deer approaches the gas pumps, go outside and ask what it needs. Be polite. Be respectful. Answer any questions it asks you with complete honesty. The deer is the closest thing you have to a friend out here. The margin note beside it simply said, "She's saved my life 3 times." A deer that asks questions and saves lives. Shadow people who stand at counters for hours. Voices that call your name from empty rooms. Each rule was a window into a nightmare, and I was expected to navigate this maze of impossibilities for 8 hours every night. The absurdity of it should have made me laugh, should have convinced me this was all an elaborate prank, but something in my gut told me these rules were written in blood and terror. The clock ticked over to 11:34 p.m., and the temperature in the store dropped noticeably. I could see my breath misting in the air, despite the fact that the thermostat still read 72 degrees. Rule number 5. If the temperature drops suddenly and you can see your breath, stand behind the counter and do not move until it passes. They're walking through. Do not draw attention to yourself. I planted my feet behind a register and forced myself to become as still as possible. The cold intensified, spreading through the store like an invisible tide. The fluorescent lights flickered but stayed on. Thank God, because rule number 1 had made it abundantly clear that darkness was not my friend in this place. I kept my breathing shallow and quiet, my eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, not focusing on anything in particular. That's when I saw them. Not directly, but in my peripheral vision. Shapes moving through the aisles, tall and impossibly thin, their movements jerky and wrong like footage played at the wrong speed. They didn't walk so much as they glided, their forms barely visible, more like distortions in the air than solid entities. I counted 4 of them, maybe 5, passing between the shelves like sharks circling prey. One of them paused near the counter, and I could feel its attention on me, a weight that pressed against my skin like physical touch. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there exposed and vulnerable. But the rule had been clear: do not move, do not draw attention. So I stood there, barely breathing, while something that shouldn't exist studied me with senses I couldn't comprehend. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the temperature began to rise. The shapes faded, their presence dissipating like smoke and wind. I checked the clock. 11:41 p.m. 7 minutes. I'd held still for 7 minutes while things from somewhere else walked through the gas station. My legs were trembling when I finally allowed myself to move, and I had to grip the counter to stay upright. This was my first night, my first hour, really, and already I'd experienced more impossibilities than I'd encountered in my entire life. What the hell had I gotten myself into? The pay Joe had mentioned seemed laughably inadequate now. No amount of money was worth this, was it? But even as I thought it, I knew I wouldn't leave. Not yet. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was something else, something about this place that got its hooks into you and wouldn't let go. I returned to the rule book, determined to memorize every instruction, every warning, every margin note left by previous survivors. Because that's what we were, I realized, survivors, not employees. Each shift was a test, each night a gauntlet to be run. The rules were our weapons, our armor, our only defense against whatever lurked in the spaces between normal and nightmare. Rule number 16, near the end of the book, caught my eye. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. The rules will keep you safe, but only if you're smart enough to follow them exactly. Do not improvise. Do not test the boundaries. There are no second chances here. Outside, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. My first customer was approaching, and I had no idea which rules I might need to apply. I straightened my shoulders, took a deep breath, and prepared myself for whatever came through that door. The night was still young, and I had a horrible feeling that the real strangeness hadn't even begun yet. The door chime rang as someone stepped inside, and I looked up to greet them. What I saw made every muscle in my body go rigid with primal fear. But I remember the rules. I remembered Joe's warning, and I forced a smile onto my face, even as my mind screamed that the thing standing in the doorway was most definitely not human. The man, if I could call him that, stood in the doorway for a long moment, not moving, not blinking. He wore a suit that looked like it had last been fashionable in the 1950s, complete with a thin tie and a fedora that cast his face in shadow. But it was his stillness that unsettled me most. He didn't sway, didn't shift his weight, didn't make any of the tiny unconscious movements that living bodies make. He was as motionless as a photograph. Then he stepped forward, and the fluorescent lights revealed his face. It was too smooth, too perfect, like a wax figure or a mannequin. His smile was fixed and wide, showing too many teeth, and his eyes didn't reflect the light properly. They absorbed it, creating flat black pools where his pupils should have been. I quickly checked his feet and felt my stomach drop. No shadow, not even a hint of one, despite the bright overhead lights that cast my own shadow crisp and dark against the floor. Rule number 7. Do not serve anyone who cannot cast a shadow in the overhead lights. Refuse politely but firmly. They will leave on their own if you do not engage. I gripped the edge of the counter and cleared my throat. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't help you tonight. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, which was something of a miracle considering my heart was trying to punch its way out of my chest. The man's smile didn't waver, didn't change at all. He tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly too far, like a bird examining a particularly interesting insect. But I've come such a long way, he said, and his voice had a strange quality to it, like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, slightly out of sync. Surely you can make an exception. Do not engage. The rule had been clear. I need you to leave. Now, I kept my eyes fixed on his forehead, not meeting that terrible flat gaze. The temperature in the store had started to drop again, and I could see my breath misting in the air. For a moment, nothing happened. The man-thing stood there, his smile frozen, his head still tilted at that wrong angle. Then, without any transition, without even the hint of movement, he was simply gone. Not walking out the door, not turning to leave, just gone, like he'd been edited out of reality. The temperature immediately returned to normal, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I checked the clock. 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes until midnight. 7 minutes until the most dangerous 3-hour period began, the window when the rules became even more critical and the boundaries between normal and nightmare grew thinnest. I decided to do a quick walk around the store while I still could, checking that everything was in order before the witching hours arrived. The aisles looked normal enough. Chips, candy, motor oil, the usual gas station fare. But as I walked, I noticed small details that seemed off. Some of the product labels were wrong, brands I'd never heard with names that were almost but not quite familiar. Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. Lace instead of Lace. And some packages were in languages I didn't recognize, symbols and characters that hurt to look at too long, like they were shifting and rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I was examining one particularly strange can of what might have been soup when I heard the door chime again. I quickly returned to the counter, glancing at the clock. 11:58 p.m. The new arrival was a woman in a long dress that looked like it belonged in a period drama, all lace and layers and buttons up to her throat. Her hair was pinned up in an elaborate style, and she carried a small clutch purse that looked hand-stitched. Unlike the shadowless man, she seemed more solid, more present, but there was still something deeply wrong about her. She approached the counter with small, precise steps, and when she opened her purse, I saw that it contained dozens of coins, old ones, their surfaces tarnished and worn. She placed 3 of them on the counter with a soft clink. They looked like silver dollars, but the dates were wrong. 1887, 1891, 1903, and the faces stamped on them weren't any presidents I recognized. Rule number 14. Do not accept payment in any currency that is not modern U.S. legal tender. If offered antique coins, foreign currency, or anything else, politely decline and ask for regular payment. If they cannot provide it, give them what they want for free and ask them to leave. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't accept these, I said, pushing the coins back toward her. They were cold to the touch, so cold they almost burned my fingertips. Do you have any regular money? Cards. She looked at me with eyes that were too large for her face, too dark, like pools of ink. This is all I have, she said, and her voice was soft and sad, like wind through empty rooms. I just want to go home. Please, I just want to go home. There was such genuine despair in her voice that I felt my resolve waver. But the rules existed for a reason, and something told me that deviating from them, even out of kindness, would have consequences I couldn't imagine. What were you looking to buy? I asked. She pointed to the coffee station with one pale finger. Just coffee. I've been driving for so long. I'm so cold. The clock ticked over to midnight. The lights flickered once, and in that brief moment of dimness, I saw the woman as she truly was, desiccated, ancient, her skin like dried leather stretched over bones, her mouth open in a silent scream. Then the lights stabilized, and she looked normal again, just a sad woman in an old-fashioned dress. The coffee's free, I said quickly, my voice tight. Take as much as you need, but then you should go. You should really go. She nodded slowly and moved to the coffee station. I watched her pour a cup with shaking hands, saw the steam rise in the cold air. She raised it to her lips, and I could have sworn I saw the coffee pass right through her, splashing onto the floor, though when I looked down, the tiles were dry. She set the empty cup down, turned to me, and mouthed two words, "Thank you." Then she walked to the door and stepped outside. I watched through the window as she moved toward an old car I hadn't noticed before, something from the 1940s or 50s, all rounded edges and chrome. She got in, and the car pulled away, its taillights fading into the darkness of Highway 666. But here's what made my blood freeze. The car had left no tire tracks in the dust of the parking lot. The next 2 hours were a blur of strangeness. A man came in whose reflection in the window showed something with horns and too many limbs. I served him quickly, hands shaking, not looking at anything but the register. A child appeared at 1:17 a.m., standing perfectly still in aisle 3, just staring at me with black eyes. I remembered Rule 11, which said if you see a child alone in the store between midnight and 3 a.m., ignore them completely. Do not speak to them. Do not acknowledge them. They will leave on their own. I kept my eyes on my phone, on the counter, on anything but that child, until I heard the soft patter of footsteps and the door chime announce their departure. When I finally looked up, there was a small handprint on the window, but the fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. I didn't clean it off. Something told me it needed to stay there, a warning or a ward or both. At 2:34 a.m., a truck pulled up to the pumps outside, and I watched as a perfectly normal-looking man began to fill his tank. But then I noticed his movements. He would reach for the pump, then his hand would be on the pump with no transition. He would look one direction, then his head would be facing another way without turning. It was like watching someone lag in a video game, reality skipping frames of his existence. I glanced down at the rule book, finding rule number 10. If a customer's movements seem to skip or jump like frames being cut from a film, do not panic. Complete their transaction normally. They are unstuck in time, experiencing this moment along with countless others. To them, you are the one moving strangely. Be patient. Be kind. They are more lost than you will ever be. When the man came inside, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. He was experiencing every moment simultaneously. I realized, living and reliving this night over and over. Just the gas, he said, and his voice echoed strangely, as if coming from multiple moments at once. $38.50, I said, and he handed me exact change, his movements stuttering and jumping. Our fingers touched briefly when he took his receipt, and for just a second, I felt it, the sensation of being pulled in multiple directions at once, of existing in several moments simultaneously. It was nauseating and terrifying and mercifully brief. "Thank you," he said, and there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you for being kind." Then he was gone, or maybe he had never been there, or perhaps he was still there, but in a different moment. Time was proving to be as unreliable as everything else in this place. The clock showed 2:47 a.m., 13 minutes until 3, until the most dangerous period ended, and things returned to their regular level of nightmare. I could make it. I had to make it. Outside, Highway 666 stretched in the darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, I knew things were waiting, watching, testing the boundaries of the rules that kept them at bay. But as long as I followed those rules, as long as I stayed alert and didn't let fear make me stupid, I would survive this night. I had to believe that. The alternative was unthinkable. At 2:51 a.m., the lights flickered again, but this time they didn't immediately stabilize. They pulsed, bright, then dim, then bright again, creating a strobe effect that made everything in the store seem to move in jerky stop motion. I gripped the counter, remembering rule number 1 with desperate clarity. The lights had to stay on, no matter what. But what happened if they went out on their own? The rule book hadn't covered that scenario, and the omission felt deliberate, as if the very possibility was too terrible to write down. The temperature plummeted so fast I could see frost forming on the refrigerator doors. My breath came out in great plumes of white vapor. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed angrily, fighting against something that wanted them to go dark. I looked around frantically for the electrical panel, knowing I might need to flip breakers, but having no idea where Joe had said it was. Had he even mentioned it? The training had been so brief, so focused on the rules that practical matters like electrical systems had seemed unimportant. Then, as suddenly as it started, the flickering stopped. The lights burned steady and bright, maybe even brighter than before, as if they were asserting their dominance over the darkness. The temperature remained cold, though, and in the new stillness, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand on end. Scratching. It was coming from inside the walls, a dry scraping sound like fingernails on wood, moving through the building in circuits, tracing the perimeter of the store. Rule number 17, the last one, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. If you hear something in the walls, do not investigate. Do not acknowledge it. Whatever is in there is contained. Breaking the walls to find it would be the last mistake you ever make. Just let it move. Let it search. It cannot reach you as long as the walls remain intact. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was in there knew I was listening. It moved behind the refrigerators, through the space between the ceiling and the roof, down through the walls near the restroom. I forced myself to focus on something. Anything else? I grabbed a rag and began wiping down the already clean counter. The simple mechanical action helping to keep my mind from fracturing under the weight of fear. That's when I noticed the gas pump display through the window. Pump number 3 showed an active transaction, the numbers climbing steadily. But there was no car at pump 3. No customer outside. Just the empty concrete island and the hose hanging in its cradle. The numbers kept rising. $20, $30, $40, with no one touching anything. Rule number 12. If a gas pump activates on its own, go outside and shut it off manually. Move quickly but calmly. Do not run. Whatever is using the pump will not harm you if you show no fear. Complete the shutdown procedure and return inside. Do not look directly at what might be standing near the pump. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the master key for the pump controls. The door felt heavier than usual when I pushed it open, and the night air that greeted me was wrong. It didn't flow or move like normal air. It hung thick and viscous like walking through gelatin. The sky above was starless and black, not the normal darkness of night, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light. I walked toward pump 3, keeping my eyes fixed on the control panel, not looking at the space where a car should be, but wasn't. The numbers on the display had stopped at $66.66. Of course they had. This place had a sense of humor. It seemed, dark and twisted as it was. I inserted the key and turned it, shutting down the pump. The display went blank. In my peripheral vision, I saw something standing on the other side of the pump. Tall, very tall, with proportions that didn't match human anatomy. Long arms that hung past where its knees should be. A head that seemed too small for its body, or maybe too large. My mind couldn't quite process what my eyes were seeing. It stood perfectly still, and I could feel its attention on me, heavy and expectant. Do not run. Show no fear. I pulled the key out with steady hands, even though my entire body was screaming at me to bolt. I turned and walked back to the door, my pace measured and even, fighting every instinct that told me to sprint. The thing didn't move, didn't follow, but I could feel its gaze on my back like a physical touch until I stepped inside and the door closed behind me. I made it 3 steps before my legs gave out. I sat down hard on the floor, my back against the counter, breathing in great gasping lungfuls of air. The clock showed 2:58 a.m., 2 minutes until 3. 2 minutes until the worst period ended. I could make it. I had made it this far. But the night wasn't done with me yet. At exactly 2:59 a.m., the payphone rang again. I dragged myself upright and stumbled to it, lifting the receiver with hands that had finally stopped shaking. I didn't speak, just waited as Rule 8 instructed. The voice that came through was different this time. Clearer, closer. It sounded like my own voice, but wrong, like a recording played backward and forward simultaneously. The deer is coming, my voice that wasn't my voice said. Answer truthfully. Your life depends on it. The line went dead. I hung up and checked my watch, starting the 30-second timer as instructed, though the message had been much shorter than that. When I looked up at the windows, I saw her. The deer. She stood just outside the glass, larger than any deer I'd ever seen. Her coat a deep russet brown that seemed to absorb light. But her eyes were too knowing, too intelligent, holding an awareness that no animal should possess. She walked to the door, and somehow, impossibly, it opened for her. The chime rang as she entered, her hose clicking on the linoleum floor with sharp, precise sounds. She moved with an uncanny grace, and when she stopped in front of me, I could smell earth and pine and something older, something that reminded me of deep forests and ancient things. "Hello, Ethan," she said, and her voice was like wind through leaves, multitonal and beautiful and terrible all at once. "You've done well tonight, better than most on their first shift. I remember the rule. Be polite, be respectful, answer truthfully. Thank you." I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, studying me with those too intelligent eyes. "I have questions for you. 3 questions. Answer them truthfully, and you'll be under my protection for the remainder of your employment here. Lie, even once, and I will leave you to face what comes alone. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, and meant it. Whatever this creature was, I knew instinctively that her protection would be invaluable. The Marginot had said she'd save someone's life 3 times. I wanted that protection. I needed it. "First question," the deer said, taking a step closer. "Why did you take this job?" "The real reason, not the one you told yourself. I wanted to say it was for the money, or because I needed work, but she'd been clear about truth." I dug deeper, past the comfortable lies, to the uncomfortable reality beneath. "Because I wanted to disappear," I said finally. "Because working in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by impossible things, seemed easier than facing my real life. Because I thought maybe here, I could be someone different, someone braver. The deer nodded slowly. Second question, when the man without a shadow stood in the doorway, you felt something. What was it? I thought back to that moment, to the feeling that had preceded the fear. Recognition, I said quietly. For just a second, I recognized something in him. An emptiness, a lack of something essential. And I was afraid because I see that same emptiness when I look in mirrors sometimes. Good, the deer said, and there was approval in her voice. Truth, painful as it is. Final question. If I offered you the chance to leave right now, to walk away from this place and never return, with no consequences and no memory of what you've seen tonight, would you take it? I opened my mouth to say yes, of course yes. Anyone would be insane not to take that offer. But I stopped, because I realized, somewhere in the chaos and terror of the last few hours, something had shifted inside me. I'd faced impossible things and survived. I'd followed the rules and made it through. And in doing so, I felt more alive, more present, more real than I had in years. No, I said, I wouldn't take it. Not yet. The deer's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. Then you are exactly what this place needs, Ethan. What is always needed. The protection is yours. She turned and walked back to the door, pausing with one hoof on the threshold. The rules will keep you safe, but remember, they were written by people who survived by hiding. There may come a night when you need to do more than survive. When that time comes, trust yourself. You're stronger than you know. Then she was gone, melting into the pre-dawn darkness. I looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m. The dangerous hours had passed. I made it through my first night, or at least through the worst of it. The sky outside was beginning to lighten imperceptibly, the absolute blackness giving way to the deep blue that preceded sunrise. But the deer's words echoed in my mind. The rules were written by people who survived by hiding. What did that mean? What came after surviving? And why did I have the terrible feeling that I was going to find out? The last few hours of my shift passed in a haze of exhaustion and hypervigilance. After the deer left, the store settled into something approximating normalcy, though I'd never be able to think of this place as normal again. A few legitimate customers came through. A truck driver at 4:30 a.m. who was blessedly ordinary. A traveling salesman at 5:15 who paid with a credit card and didn't do anything stranger than complain about the coffee. I watched them carefully anyway, checking for shadows, observing their movements, making sure their reflections matched their bodies. The rule book sat open on the counter, and I'd spent the quiet moments committing each rule to memory, studying the margin notes like they were scripture. Because that's what they were, really. Gospel written by prophets who'd survived their own journeys through darkness. I understood now why Joe had looked so broken. It wasn't just the fear or the strangeness. It was the knowledge, the burden of understanding that the world was so much bigger and more terrible than most people would ever know. At 6:47 a.m., the sky outside began to lighten in earnest. The darkness that had seemed so absolute and oppressive slowly retreated, revealing the desert landscape in shades of pink and gold. It should have been beautiful, but instead it felt like a curtain being drawn back, revealing the stage where tonight's performance had taken place. The gas station, the empty highway, the vast expanse of scrubland. In daylight, they looked almost innocent. But I knew better now. I knew what lived in the spaces between things, what walked through when the boundaries grew thin. Joe arrived at 6:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, just as he'd told me to be. He looked marginally better than he had the night before, though his eyes were still ringed with dark circles that spoke of troubled sleep. He paused in the doorway, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Then he nodded slowly, something like respect crossing his face. "You made it," he said, and there was genuine relief in his voice. I wasn't sure. The first night is always the hardest. "Did you?" He hesitated. "Did you meet her?" I didn't need to ask who he meant. The deer. Yes. She asked me 3 questions. Joe's eyes widened. And you answered truthfully? All 3. All 3. He let out a long breath, and some of the tension left his shoulders. Then you got a chance. A real chance. Most people don't get her protection on their first night. Hell, I didn't get it until my 3rd week. And even then, only because I'd helped a customer who turned out to be, he stopped himself. Well, that's a story for another time. Did anything else happen? Any rule violations? I walked him through the night, describing each encounter, each strange occurrence. He nodded along, occasionally adding context or warnings. The woman with the antique coins, she comes by about once a month. Always want coffee, always trying to get home. Best we can do is give her a moment of warmth, even if it doesn't last. He pointed to one of the rules. The man without a shadow, he's persistent. He'll try different approaches, different tactics. Never let him in. Never. As we talked, the morning sun climbed higher, and the store transformed around us. The shadows that had seemed so menacing in the darkness shrank and faded. The aisles looked mundane again, just shelves of junk food and motor oil. The windows that had shown such terrible things in their reflections now just reflected the breaking dawn. But the transformation felt like a disguise, a mask the place wore during daylight hours. I knew what it really was now. I'd seen beneath the surface. Why do you keep working here? I asked suddenly. If you know what this place is, what happens here, why stay? Joe was quiet for a long moment, staring out the highway. Because someone has to, he said finally. This place exists whether we're here or not. But when we're here, following the rules, keeping the lights on, we maintain, I don't know, a buffer maybe. A safe zone. You saw how those things respected the boundaries, the rules. Without us, without someone to maintain this space, who knows what might come through? What might use this station as a doorway to somewhere else? The implications settled over me like a weight. We weren't just employees. We were gatekeepers, guardians of a threshold between the normal world and whatever existed on the other side. The gas station wasn't just a waypoint on Highway 666. It was a seal, a ward, maintained through ritual observance of rules that had been learned through blood and terror. The pay seems inadequate, I said, trying for humor and not quite managing it. Joe cracked a small smile. There are other compensations. You felt it, didn't you? During the night. Despite the fear, despite the impossibility of it all, you felt alive. He met my eyes. That's what this place gives you. Terror and wonder in equal measure. The absolute certainty that there's more to existence than the mundane gray reality most people settle for. Some of us need that. We need to know that magic and horror are real, that the universe is stranger and more vast than we can comprehend. He was right. I had felt it. In the spaces between fear and the moments when I've faced down impossible things and survived, there had been something else, a kind of terrible joy, the thrill of existing on the knife's edge between worlds. I thought about the deer's final words. You're stronger than you know. Maybe that's what this place really did. It stripped away all your comfortable illusions and showed you what you were really made of. Joe handed me a schedule. 3 nights a week to start. We'll see how you handle it. Most people don't last more than a month. The isolation gets to them, or they break a rule, and he shrugged. Well, let's just say we go through a lot of employees. But something tells me you might be different. The deer doesn't offer her protection lightly. I looked down at the schedule, seeing my name penciled in for Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights. 3 nights a week of navigating nightmare logic and impossible rules. 3 nights a week of standing guard against things that shouldn't exist. Part of me wanted to crumple the paper and walk away. But a larger part, the part that had woken up during the night shift, wanted to understand, to learn, to see what else existed in the shadows. I'll be here, I said, and meant it. Joe nodded, satisfied. Good. Now go home. Get some sleep. And Ethan, he waited until I looked at him. Don't talk about this place. Don't try to explain it to people who haven't seen it. They won't believe you, and the doubt in their eyes will make you question your own sanity. What happens here? What you experience, keep it to yourself. Or talk to me. I'm the only one who'll understand. I drove home as the sun climbed higher, the gas station shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was just a small white dot against the vast expanse of desert. Highway 666 stretched out behind me, empty and innocent in the daylight. But I knew what it became when darkness fell. I knew what waited at mile marker 139, what walked the aisles and tested the boundaries of reality. That night, I dreamed of the woman in the old-fashioned dress, forever driving through an endless night, searching for a home she'd never reach. I dreamed of the man without a shadow, standing in doorways across time and space, always smiling that terrible smile. I dreamed of the deer, her two intelligent eyes watching me from the edge of dark forests. And in my dreams, I heard scratching in the walls, felt the weight of attention from things that existed in spaces between spaces. When I woke, it was late afternoon. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. I had 6 hours until my next shift, 6 hours to prepare myself mentally for another journey into the impossible. I should have been terrified, should have been looking for other jobs, making plans to escape. Instead, I found myself looking forward to it. The anticipation wasn't quite eagerness. It was too mixed with dread for that, but it was close. I spent the time reviewing the rules in my mind, preparing strategies for different scenarios, thinking about the deer's cryptic message. The rules were written by people who survived by hiding. What happened when hiding wasn't enough? What came after survival? As I drove back to the gas station that night, the sun setting in my rearview mirror and darkness gathering ahead, I realized something fundamental had changed. I wasn't the same person who'd shown up for that first shift. The night at the gas station had stripped something away, some comfortable illusion about the nature of reality, and replaced it with knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. The gas station appeared on the horizon, its lights already burning bright against the gathering darkness. Highway 666 stretched ahead, leading into mysteries I was only beginning to understand. Joe's truck was in the parking lot, waiting for me to arrive so he could leave, so he could hand over responsibility for the threshold for another night. I pulled into the employee spot and checked the time, 10:47 p.m., 13 minutes before my shift began. 13 minutes to prepare for whatever the night might bring. As I walked toward the entrance, I saw the deer standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the twilight. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or approval, or perhaps warning. Then she turned and melted into the darkness of the desert. Inside, Joe was waiting with the rule book open on the counter. "Ready for night 2?" he asked. I looked around the store, at the aisles that held secrets and horrors, at the windows that showed reflections of impossible things, at the pay phone that received calls from nowhere. I thought about the rules and the reasons behind them, about the things that walked between worlds and the thin line we maintained against them. "Ready," I said, and as the clock ticked toward 11, as the last light faded from the sky and Highway 666 became a dark ribbon stretching into infinity, I felt it again. That terrible joy, that mix of fear and wonder that came from standing at the boundary of the impossible. The night shift was beginning, and I was exactly where I needed to be. Whatever came through that door tonight, whatever tested the rules and pushed against the boundaries, I would be ready. Because I understood now what this place really was, what we really did here. We weren't just gas station attendants. We were the ones who kept the lights burning in the darkness. We were the ones who maintained the rules that kept reality from fracturing completely. We were gatekeepers, guardians, the last line of defense against chaos. The job didn't pay much, but the compensation, as Joe had said, came in other forms. In knowledge, in strength, in the absolute certainty that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than anyone could imagine. And in knowing that when darkness came, when impossible walked through the door, we would be there to face it. The clock struck 11. My shift had begun, and I was ready for whatever the night might bring.